Greetings, Plolodors, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
And, more specifically, welcome to the curious case of the Manfish. When you look back at the early days of Warhammer 40,000 models, you tend to find a lot of oddities. This is often just because the familiar aesthetics of the many factions within the game hadn't been nailed down yet, and they were still experimenting, hence some of the more unusual Space Marines you got from early on. But there's some that were a little more curious. Sometimes the models were only advertised very briefly, like the Dominators, or were originally part of a separate range, like the minis made to tie in with the roguelike solitaire game Chainsaw Warrior. However, the ones we want to talk about today are both of these things and more. They even connect to a few other topics we've previously made videos on, so that's going to be exciting, isn't it? So strap in, because we're about to just flood you with a bunch of information that will have zero use to you unless you happen to be making a video about this kind of thing, in which case that would mean that you are us.
In the March 1988 Rogue Trader Flyer, alongside the truly radical power boards and Nev, there were a trio of metal alien models available that look a bit different from other 40k models due to having their own solid bases, rather than the standard plastic slaughter bases. These were the strange fish-like Slahash and Plolodor, and the very wolfy Wolfen, but we don't care about him right now. Sorry. It's said that these were all created during playtesting of 40k, so the fact they look a bit strange makes sense. The standards for 40k may not have necessarily been established at that point. These models quickly disappeared from the catalogues, but, unusually, the two fishmen are actually currently available to buy from Wargames Foundry, as the moulds for them belonged to Brian Ansell, so they were able to start producing them again a few years back. So obviously, we had to buy some. Like the earliest Rogue Trader models, they're just a single piece of metal, and on the bottom they have FF65 written on them for reasons I'm sure have no relation to anything we'll talk about later in the video. Overall, the sculpts are a bit wonky in some areas, but are honestly a lot better than we were expecting based on the messy black and white blobs that were in the old flyer. Also, this is not particularly important, but if you want to know what sort of miniatures company Wargames Foundry is compared to GW, well, our order came with free branded beer mats. As far as size goes, these fishmen are pretty small. Once placed on a conventional base, they do fit in with many of the other very early 40k models, which tended to skew a little bit smaller than what would come even a short time later, which of course means that when they're compared to something modern like a Primaris, they look less like a threatening alien warrior, and more like a small green child who's been told they can't have a McDonald's.
Probably the most notable feature of these models is their gaping mouths, which, along with their whole Lovecraftian Deep One vibe, differentiates them from the other early Rogue Trader fish alien, the Piscean Warrior. It also feels notable that they're basically naked aside from a few bits of string, just letting us get a good old look at some of that business. Something that you might have noticed is that they look less like aliens and more like fantasy monsters with guns. Guns which were possibly reused from the Citadel Judge Dredd line from 1985. And there's a good reason for that. You see, back in the late 70s to mid 80s, White Dwarf had a column called Fiend Factory that published a huge amount of new monsters for Dungeons & Dragons, many of which became official D&D monsters in the Fiend folio and are still around to this day, like the Hook Horror or Gith Yankee. We did a whole video on it a while ago if you're interested.
Fiend Factory also spawned a model line of the same name from Citadel, which made models of many of the monsters from it for use in D&D. And any other game that necessitated monsters, I suppose. This line happened to contain 3 models under the name of the Ferocious Manfish, circa 1982. Upon closer inspection, 2 of these are just Slahash and Plolodor, but without the guns, or indeed any weapons at all. They just had empty hands for weapons to be fitted into. This also explains what the FF65 on the bases meant, since it's just the old code for these models. FF meant Fiend Factory. Also, for completeness' sake, we're pretty sure that Wolfen was likewise a modified FF19 werewolf from the same range. The Manfish didn't seem to relate to a specific monster published in the Fiend Factory column, but not everything in the range appeared there, so that's not that unusual. And we could have just missed it since there were a lot of Fiend Factory monsters. I suppose given the size of their gob, they could have been based on the spine scale, although that White Dwarf monster predates Fiend Factory and it's a big frog, not a fish. Regardless, this does explain why the models didn't have slaughter bases. They were originally produced for a range where that wasn't the standard.
Once Fiend Factory ended and the rights to produce many of the monsters went elsewhere, some of the more generic ones would be repurposed. As such, the ferocious Manfish would calm down a little bit and become simply Menfish as part of the Warhammer C22 Creatures line in 1983, alongside some fellow Fiend Factory models and some other minis previously belonging to other ranges. This was back when they would often just have drawn depictions of the models instead of photographs, so telling specific models apart can be tricky. But their wide-mouth glory can be seen regardless of the medium. And since they were now part of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle line, it stands to reason that they would have rules within Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which they did in the original 1983 rulebook for Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
The Manfish is a strange synthesis of man and fish, humanoid but scaled, and capable of living underwater as well as on land. Independent by nature, they mount night attacks on the fishing villages of men, elves, goblins and others with equal indifference.
They lived in underwater caves, feared fire and direct sunlight, could move through water and boggy ground at normal speeds, and that's about all we know about the Manfish. Warhammer 1st edition wasn't exactly overflowing with lore. I mean, there's entries like halflings. They are small. Models for them exist. So these Manfishes have shown up in 3 different games over the course of a few years, but guess what? There's one more. Kinda. Sorta.
Laserburn was a sci-fi skirmish game written by Brian Ansell and released in 1980. It's another thing that we've done a whole video on if you want more details on it, but in short, it was a precursor to 40k in a lot of ways, but it wasn't published by GW. When the new Wargames Foundry casts of the Manfish were announced, this is what Brian's son Marcus had to say about them.
We found a very old master mould for a pair of fishermen with science fiction guns Brian converted from fantasy models to playtest Laserburn and later on Rogue Trader.
So it would appear that these foul fishmen had connections to yet another game, and it also confirms that Brian was the one who converted the sci-fi versions. Still not sure who sculpted the original, so if you know, then please do let us know in the comments. Also, yeah, once Wargames Foundry got a hold of them, they started calling them fishmen rather than Manfish. Not sure why, but we all have to deal with it. Although, thinking on it, if these were used to playtest Laserburn, the timeline doesn't really add up. Okay, so Rogue Trader was released in 1987, with development stretching as far back as around 1982, so it makes sense that the Manfish could have been used in playtesting since the models came out around the start of its development. But Laserburn predates the Manfish, and the guns used to modify them, if indeed they were from the Judge Dredd game, by a few years. So the only way that could possibly make sense is if they meant playtesting the Laserburn expansions, the last of which came out in 1983, or the sculpts and everything were done many years before they were released and Brian had access to them, or when they said Laserburn they actually meant Confrontation since that was also kind of Laserburn, or he could have just been misremembering, it was a long time ago after all. Whatever the truth, these funky little flounders had their fins in a surprising amount of pies over the years.
As a final entry to the grand saga of the Manfish, eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that only 2 out of the 3 original Manfishes were converted into sci-fi counterparts, with this one remaining unconverted. Well, lest you think he got left out, that one did eventually see conversion and release by Wargames Foundry for 2019's Bring Out Your Lead event, a yearly Oldhammer thing held in Nottinghamshire. Fishman 3 is armed with a heavy weapon that appears to be an unused sculpt originally intended for 40k back in its infancy. So that's cool. With all that said and done, it means that if you buy one of these models today, then you've got an old 40k model, not made by GW, that's also a D&D model, that's also a Warhammer Fantasy model. It's the sort of thing that could only happen during that specific period where the brands involved weren't the same brands they are today, so a generic enough model could float around a bit. Like a fish.
And since this model is in a nebulous state of being something that is kind of a Games Workshop figure and kind of not, of course we asked at Warhammer World if we'd be allowed to use it there.
And the answer we got was basically, yeah, whatever. Yeah, sure, okay.
Also, whenever we approach the staff in there, they hide behind the counters now. I don't know why, it's probably a COVID thing. Welcome to the end of the video, friends and enemies. If you enjoyed it, please consider helping us slay the monster that is the YouTube algorithm by feeding it your engagement. Comments, likes, subscriptions, you know the deal. Many thanks to Alexis and Remleiz for lending us their voices for this video. And if you would like to see yourself join the lovely list of names scrolling past right now, then you can for as little as $1 on patreon.com/snipeandwib. You'll also get early access to videos and some exclusive content. But it's the name. I know it's the name scrolling past that's the big draw here. Anyway, I'm in real time realizing that I should probably script these end things. So bye.